Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and today I'm going to be reviewing to you
Persona 5 Tactica!
for the Nintendo Switch. In case you couldn't tell by now, I really love Persona 5. In fact, I love it so much that the last 3 years in a row, when I did a best games list, a Persona game made it on. In 2020, there was Tokyo Mirage Sessions Sharp FE Encore. 2021 had Persona 5 Strikers. In 2022, we finally had the release of Persona 5 Royal after being teased so many times in other games. Now we get yet another spin-off based in the Persona 5 universe, and a lot of people online have been saying that Persona 5 is getting a little bit of overkill and that Atlus should just hurry up and make Persona 6. I personally don't really care, as I love this universe and its characters so much that I'm happy to get another game. I'm especially happy that Persona 5 Tactica is heavily inspired by Mario+Rabbids Sparks of Hope, another game which I really loved. So that made it a lot easier to jump in and pick this up. Basically, this game takes the basic fundamentals of Sparks of Hope, but adds Persona flair to it. Just in case you haven't played a Persona game before, let me give you the basics of how those games are supposed to work. Basically, it's a mixture between social interactions and dungeon crawling, and depending on what you do during your free time, that'll increase your stats in the dungeons. Each character has something called a persona, which is like the incarnation of the desires of their hearts, and these personas allow them to do special abilities, such as burning the enemy or healing your teammates. That's basically the gist of it, but in Persona 5 Tactica, they simplify it so much that it both helps and hinders the pacing, but we'll get to the hindrance a little bit later. For now, let's just say that there are no side activities, no wandering around, no social links. It's just battle after battle. You'll have menus and stuff where you can talk to your teammates and fill up a skill tree, but overall this game just wants you to get into the action as quickly as possible. Personas have been simplified so that every character has two personas. You have your main persona, like Joker will always have Arsene and Mona will always have Garu, for example. But now you can equip a second one. Yes, every character can now equip a second one, not just Joker. And these extra personas will beef up your attack stats and give you additional bonuses, as well as giving you new abilities, like Mona can finally use fire if you have a fire persona, for example. This originally complicated things a bit, as I already thought making personas for Joker alone in Persona 5 was complicated enough. But eventually I started to realize that this game massively simplified the concept, so that now it's just, you just get additional abilities and these buff up your stats, and it's about as simple as that. And I think that overall made it easier. In addition, when you go to the gun shop, you no longer have to worry about various parameters. You just have to worry about, okay, is this going to raise my attack or is it going to lower my attack? Now that you've gotten the gist of how this game is simpler than other Persona games, let's get into the basic gameplay. So each character has a certain range of movement, but you can move freely within that range, just like you could in Sparks of Hope. You can also freely switch between the characters as long as they haven't taken an action. So for instance, you could move Joker to a certain space and then move Mona around and then move Joker again once you've gotten into position. This could also help for, say, moving your units out of the way because they can't pass through each other, or if there are stages that might require pressing switches and you don't stop when you hit a switch, thankfully, so that can really help with some of the later puzzles. Once it's time to actually take action, you usually can perform one of two basic attacks. You can shoot with your gun, or you can use your skills, which in most characters' cases is use their persona abilities. In Arena's case, her skills are significantly simplified because she doesn't have a persona, but it doesn't mean that she's less powerful. It just means you have to upgrade her skill tree more because she doesn't have the additional buffs that a secondary persona would give her. There are also situational actions that you can do, such as attacking an enemy head-on with a melee attack, climbing a ladder, jumping from one ledge to another if you have dash panels, etc. Each of these options has various strengths and weaknesses depending on how effectively you chain them together. For example, attacking you can only do when you're right next to the enemy, so you have to get up close and personal and be willing to charge into enemy territory and potentially be counterattacked. But the benefit is that after you attack an enemy with a melee attack, then that lowers their defenses so that if another ally attacks the enemy, they'll be able to do a one more and attack again. This also goes for if you hit an enemy with a status ailment, so you can really chain together a lot of different turns. And in addition to that, when you have a one more, you don't only get to attack again, but you can also move again, so you can use it to get across the map much more quickly. Then there's the gun, which allows you to shoot at targets far away. This has relatively limited range, and it's not as powerful as a Persona ability, but it can be useful for when you want to save skill points and just attack without having to expend your resources. And then there's the Persona abilities, which, as I mentioned, can range from shooting fire to buffing up your defense. These do use skill points though, so you have to be careful about how much you use. Dashing, that's pretty simple. You just have to be near a ladder or a dash pad. And thankfully this doesn't hamper your movement too much, and if you find that you made a mistake, you can just go back to the dash panel or ladder again to take it back. Really the only time you're forced into committing to a move is if you use a gun or a skill. So the game is usually pretty forgiving about if you made a mistake, you can take it back. In fact, I think they even learned a few lessons from the Fire Emblem series, and you can actually reset a turn if you think that you made a wrong move. You can't reset a bunch of turns like you can in the Fire Emblem games, but even just one turn being reset is a really great quality of life improvement. Just like in the Mario+Rabbids games, there are opportunities to take cover behind larger objects. Depending on the size of the object you're hiding behind will affect how much damage you take from enemy attacks. So if you're behind partial cover, then it'll reduce the amount of damage that you'll take from enemy attacks. Sometimes the game even cheats with this, and the enemies can attack you while your back is against cover, and you'll still take reduced damage. Although don't rely on this to work 100% of the time, as every now and then the enemy will still be able to knock you down. If an enemy hits you when you're not behind cover, then the enemy gets to do a one more on you. So be very careful to constantly be against an object. But when you're behind large cover, then the enemies can't hit you at all. These are fewer and farther between, but yet they can be a great way to make sure that your health bar is maximized. So the overall strategy of the game is trying your best to hit enemies with a status ailment, then taking advantage of the one more to give yourself an additional attack, so on and so on. There are a multitude of enemy types. Most of them boil down to just they shoot you from a distance. Occasionally you get these giant enemies that'll do a leaping attack after you hit them for the first time, but after doing the leap they become more vulnerable to attacks, and you can get more just one more actions on them. I won't spoil the other enemy types as the game gradually gives you more and more of them, but a lot of them seem like Mario+Rabbids enemies. I don't mean to keep comparing the two games, but I actually think that that can be a good selling point if you're not sure if you want this or not, as if you like the Mario+Rabbids game, I think it'll incentivize you to want to buy this more because you'll be like, hey, I love Mario+Rabbids. If I have an opportunity to play a third game, heck yeah, this is amazing. I know most gaming companies don't like that kind of comparison, but I think that could actually be a really good marketing tool. As the game progresses, it introduces even more elements to take into account with regards to changing up your party and your skills. For instance, you have a skill tree where you get a certain amount of skill points where you can give different abilities, such as powering up your persona attacks or being able to restore skill points when you're behind cover. And these are different for every character. Some of them have unique skills. Futaba in particular is the navigator, so she doesn't directly participate in the battle, but she can offer passive abilities to the characters every couple of turns. So for instance, she might give you more health, or she might allow you to charge your voltage meter. The voltage meter allows each character to perform a unique attack once the star gauge has filled up. Some of them work better than others, like I like how Makoto's is just hit all the enemies in a straight line at the expense of Makoto will launch herself to the end of the line, so you have to be careful about where you're positioning her. Or in the case of Joker, he causes a blast of energy to hit a bunch of enemies, and usually it allows him to attack again afterward. There are also passive abilities that the party members can give you simply by being in the battle. So for instance, if Joker's in the battle, then everyone in your party will have a more powerful gun. Then there's if units are in peak condition, which means that if you go from battle to battle in a row without returning to the hideout, which is basically your like hub world menu of sorts, then characters that are fresh that weren't in the last battle will receive a benefit to their health and attack. So for example, say you have Makoto sit out the previous battle and then you put her in the next battle, she will have better stats because she had properly rested. So it gives you an incentive to actually switch up your party, although I never ended up using Yusuke, so hopefully you guys will appreciate Matt Mercer way more than I did. Speaking of voice actors, all of the original cast from Persona 5 reprised their roles as the Phantom Thieves, and they all sound just as good as they always have. The new voice actors did a really good job as well. The problem is that I feel like the sound mixing did them a disservice, as even when I turned the music all the way, or almost all the way down, and the voice acting all the way up, it seemed like some of the lines were muffled, and it would be on a case-by-case basis. Like one row of dialogue would sound perfectly fine, but then the next, even with my switch turned all the way up, I still could barely hear it. So I highly suggest that you turn the music all the way down, or almost all the way down, and the voice acting all the way up, but even then, some of the lines just don't really work. I also think the music was not quite as good as what I'm used to from Persona 5. I think it's mainly because the music here focuses more on rock, whereas Persona 5 is more about jazz, which is a genre I personally like a little bit more than rock. But basically any track that Lynn sang in was absolutely amazing. None of them quite lived up to the amazing vocal tracks from Persona 5, but they were still catchy enough where I can say, yeah, Lynn totally didn't lose her touch. I already mentioned a few ways in which you can customize the characters between battles, but a few additional options are going to the Velvet Room and fusing the various personas that you get to make more powerful personas. You can also use the Velvet Room to sell your excess weapons, and later in the game you can do more with that, but I won't spoil it for you. The Velvet Room was one of the most confusing parts of the original Persona 5, and I'm glad to say that they simplified it considerably for this game. Even if I really don't like the music that plays, it's exactly the same as it was in Persona 4, and it's a bit too high-pitched and operatic for my taste, so near the end of the game I just got so tired of it that I muted my Switch. But you're not going to get good personas unless you go here. Now speaking of personas, the process of getting them is significantly simpler. You just get them at the end of a battle, whereas in Persona 5 you would often have to bargain with the personas in a dungeon to get them. But that's all gone, so you just get them. You don't have to do any special skills or anything, which probably would help for players that are put off by Persona 5's complexity and want something a bit easier to latch onto. You also have the option to do side quests. I hated this part of the game, as side quests are significantly harder. There is one that you are forced to do, and even on the easiest difficulty, it is really a pain to get the hold of, especially as it's really early in the game that you're forced to do it, and you're still getting used to the game's systems, and they're like expecting you to do end game levels of strategizing. After the second side quest, I just gave up and played the game normally, and I found that that worked, as long as I just switched up the difficulty. Speaking of the difficulty, I feel like that's slightly unbalanced, as easy mode was oftentimes too easy, but then normal mode was too hard at first, but then later I was getting so tired of the game being too easy that I switched over to normal mode, and that provided a good balanced challenge now that I had gotten used to the game's systems. Whereas I think when I first put it on, it was still pretty early in the game and I was still trying to adjust to everything. So I suggest just picking the difficulty as you go along. You don't have to be forced to stick to a particular one the whole time. Maybe you want to go for merciless difficulty for a certain part of the game, but maybe for the final battle, which kind of throws a really annoying twist at you, maybe you want to switch it over to easy so that you're not one-shot KO'd. Speaking of battles and the pacing, I should warn you that this game does not know when to quit. A lot of times the characters will say we are preparing for the final battle, only for them to fake you out and be like, yeah, psych, there's actually way more of the game to go, and we're gonna drag it out more with this new concept and this new character. So I suggest don't get too comfortable if you think something is the final encounter. I really don't want to give away how to tell when it's the actual final battle, as some of you may want to be surprised, but I will say just be on your guard. As far as the actual story, you might be wondering if you should play Persona 5 first. I would say either play it or look at a story summary, as yes, that game is considerably more complex in the gameplay department, but there are certain parts of the game that just give away big parts of Persona 5, and if you were like, oh shoot, that's a spoiler, I suggest you make yourself acquainted with the story of that game so that you're not told a major bombshell. This is especially evident when you'll get memos where you can look up terms from the previous game, and at one point it outright spoils the final boss of Persona 5, so use caution if you're going to go into this before playing the original game. I think the story is, for the most part, it starts out slow, but then it gradually builds up over time, especially with one of the new characters, Toshiro. I feel like he's basically the equivalent of me in real life. Like, obviously there are some differences because he's a politician, but I feel like he now takes the spot of the most relatable video game character to date. There are so many instances where I was like, yeah, that is totally something that I would say, and even when the characters insult him, I was like, hey, those are some things that my friends say about me when they don't like my methods. So it was really nice to get such a relatable story. I know that that's a sentiment that a lot of the critics use on games that are universally panned. So I'll just say that there's great development of Arena and Toshiro, but the character development for the Phantom Thieves kind of takes a backseat, as most of their development was already done in Persona 5, so the team might have figured, hey, let's not develop them even more because we've already told their stories. I think this is kind of a misstep. There are hints at when, like, their situations are relevant in the story, but they hardly ever explicitly go into details or have, like, touching character moments where they might say, yeah, I can relate, and here's how. I especially think Joker was probably hit the hardest with this, as he's still a mostly silent character where you get to choose his responses. Unfortunately, most of the choices don't matter. In fact, I could only think of 2 times in the entirety of the game where, depending on your choice, it would actually severely affect the outcome. Most players will say, well, that's how he was in Persona 5, so they're just keeping up the tradition. The problem with that is that Joker isn't the main character in this game. Sure, you get to name him whatever you want, but he's actually billed as the 3rd main character in the game's credits, with Arena and Toshiro being the main 2 in this. So, in this context, it doesn't feel like he should be getting as important of a prominent role. Like in Persona 5, that game was all about the social links and really making him a self-insert character with enough of a personality where he stood out on his own, but at the same time you could customize his responses, and depending on how you answered, you would get different endings, and that would improve or decrease your social points, and that was a big part of the game was you want to make himself insert, but at the same time, you also have to know how to do the right responses at the right time to affect the outcome of the game. In this game, they probably figured, hey, this is just Joker's character. He can't talk. He talked in the anime. I know people weren't a huge fan of that, but I feel like that would have worked better here because in this game's context, there are no social links. There are no crazy decisions. To my knowledge, there's only one ending. So it feels like it's pointless because that's how he's always been. But doing stuff for the sake of tradition just isn't something that I approve of. Overall, I love Persona 5 Tactica. It feels so great to be with these characters in this world again, and Arena and Toshiro managed to be well-developed additions to the cast, and I really appreciate how relatable Toshiro was. I love how once you get the hang of the systems in battle, then it feels like it has that flow state that I praised Mario+Rabbids Sparks of Hope for. The flexible difficulty, the simplification of the concepts in Persona 5, they all add up together to make for a very pleasing experience, especially for fans of tactics-based games. I almost forgot to mention the triple attacks, where if the characters surround an enemy, then they can do an all-out attack, which is like a cinematic attacking the enemy all at once, but I never quite figured out how to get the hang of it. I kind of just did it by accident, so hopefully you guys are better at planning that stuff out than me. I highly suggest you give this a try. It also has DLC, just in case you can't get enough of the main game, which from what I've heard is like its own side story where Akechi and Kasumi join your party, which is weird because the main game makes no reference to the events of Persona 5 Royal whatsoever, which I feel like is a misstep. Why spend extra money just to get content from the definitive version of the game? But it is only $20, which is, I guess, a decent price. I didn't get the DLC, but from what I've seen, it looks like it has a really cool mechanic where paint is involved to decrease the enemy's stats and also decrease yours if they use it against you, so Splatoon players should really appreciate it. Otherwise, this is a really good package. $60, I feel like it's actually worth the asking price because it goes on for so long. But that can also be a detriment, as the game tries so hard to be a long game that it ends up overstaying its welcome by the end and just saying, yeah, no, we still got quite a while to go. That was a fake final battle. You're not actually done yet. So yeah, give it a try. I think you'll especially love it if you like Mario+Rabbids Sparks of Hope. If you like Persona 5, you'll love it. You might not like how simple it is and how there's a lack of character interactions and social links, but if you just like pure tactical adventures and want to just get on with it, you're going to have a blast here. So with that, thank you very much for watching. Please comment down below what you think of the video. I read and respond to just about all of the comments, so I'm really excited to hear your thoughts and start a conversation. Special thanks to my patrons Matthew Rakowski, Spoon Ghost, and Splatcat for their continuous support. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!